right now. I hope you're doing well wherever you're joining me from today. Take a deep breath, settle into this moment, and allow yourself to receive only the messages that resonate with your heart. Today's reading carries an incredibly powerful energy, and before we even begin, I can already feel that someone has been thinking about you far more than they've been willing to admit. We're beginning with the Ace of Swords, and I don't want you to think of this as a prediction. Think of it as a symbol. This sword represents a moment when the truth becomes too heavy to keep buried. It's the point where silence starts breaking under the weight of everything left unsaid. What's fascinating is that this truth isn't yours. It's theirs. Immediately, I'm picking up on someone who has spent a long time convincing themselves they could move on. They tried distracting themselves. They threw themselves into work, routines, conversations, maybe even other connections. But every time they believed they had finally gained emotional distance, something reminded them of you. A song, a place, a mutual friend. Even seeing someone who looked like you for just a second was enough to bring everything rushing back. And that's why this Ace of Swords appears first. Because their biggest battle isn't with you. It's with the truth they've been avoiding. Now, here's what surprises me. This person isn't only realizing they still love you, they're realizing they never truly let you go. There's a difference. Someone can miss another person and eventually move forward, but what I'm seeing here feels different. It's as though a part of them has remained emotionally frozen at the moment. Everything changed between you. Spirit keeps drawing my attention to their thoughts rather than their actions. That's important because what they're showing the world and what they're experiencing internally are completely different stories. To everyone else, they appear composed, maybe even happy. But beneath that surface, their mind keeps returning to one question. What if I made the biggest mistake of my life? And here's where the energy shifts. Because this card isn't only exposing their truth, it's preparing them to act. I'm seeing hesitation beginning to crack. The excuses they've been hiding behind no longer feel convincing even to themselves. Something has happened recently that's forcing them to confront feelings they've kept locked away for far too long. But what exactly triggered this awakening? That's what the next card is about to reveal. Something changed because they stopped trying to control what they were feeling. The Emperor isn't showing me someone without emotions. It's showing me someone who became so focused on staying in control that they convinced themselves discipline could replace vulnerability. They believed that if they stayed busy enough, logical enough, distant enough, these feelings would eventually disappear. But they didn't. What's interesting is that this wasn't some dramatic realization. It happened quietly, little by little. I'm seeing someone who kept telling themselves, I'll deal with this tomorrow. Tomorrow became next week. Next week became months. And before they realized it, they weren't avoiding you anymore. They were avoiding themselves. Hold on. There's something very specific here. I'm getting the feeling that something recently happened that forced them to question every decision they've made since the separation. It may have been something incredibly ordinary. Maybe they heard your name unexpectedly. Maybe an old message resurfaced. Maybe they found a forgotten conversation. Or maybe life simply became quiet enough that they could no longer outrun what they were feeling. Because emotions without closure don't disappear, they wait. They remain patient until the noise fades and there's nowhere left to hide. Now they're remembering this connection very differently. Before, they focused on what went wrong. Now they're thinking about everything they never said. Everything they never did. Everything they believed there would always be time to fix. That shift changes everything. I'm also seeing them question the story they've been telling themselves. For a long time they believed leaving was the right decision, or that you were better off without them, or that reaching out would only create more pain. Those explanations once felt convincing. Now they don't. One by one, the reasons they relied on are beginning to fall apart. And as certainty disappears, something much heavier takes its place. Regret. Not the kind that passes in a moment, the kind that quietly follows someone through every part of the day. While they're driving, working, trying to fall asleep, there's another layer here. This person has been paying much closer attention than they'd ever admit. Maybe not every day, but enough to notice something important. You don't seem to be waiting anymore. Whether you've been healing, building your own life, or simply finding more peace, they're seeing a version of you that feels different, more grounded, more confident, less connected to the past. And instead of making it easier to move on, that transformation is making it impossible for them to keep pretending they're unaffected. But as their focus turns more intensely towards you, I'm sensing another energy beginning to react as well. Someone who is becoming increasingly uncomfortable watching all of this unfold. Oh my god, the Devil card is taking the interpretation in a direction I never expected. It's making me think about attachment, the kind that quietly grows stronger the more someone tries to deny it. Because the harder this person has tried to convince themselves this chapter was over, the more they found themselves pulled right back toward it. What's interesting is that I'm no longer looking only at the person who wants to reunite with you. My attention keeps drifting toward this second energy, not because they're trying to be noticed, because they're trying very hard not to be. Hold on. I'm noticing the way they react whenever your name comes up or they hear something about your life. It's subtle. A pause that's just a little too long. A smile that disappears too quickly. Questions that sound casual, but aren't. It's almost as though they're quietly collecting little pieces of information without realizing how much they care. And here's what stands out. They're not reacting to who you used to be. They're reacting to who you've become. That's the part they can't quite understand. Somewhere along the way, they expected your story to stay connected to the past. Instead, they've watched you become more grounded, more peaceful, more confident, less dependent on anyone else's approval. Whether you've noticed it or not, your energy feels steadier now, less reactive, less interested in proving yourself. Ironically, that's exactly what's becoming difficult for them to process, because every positive change they see forces them to question assumptions they made long ago. They believed healing would take longer. They believed you'd still be looking back. They believed there would always be another chance to step back into your life whenever they were ready. Now they're beginning to wonder whether that opportunity still exists. There's another layer here. This isn't only about missing you. It's about losing certainty. For a long time, they believed they understood exactly where they stood in your life. Even through silence, even through distance, they assumed the emotional connection would always remain. But recently, that certainty has started slipping away. And that's where the pressure begins. Not because you've tried to prove anything, simply because your life keeps moving forward. Every step you take toward your own peace quietly challenges the story they've been telling themselves. What's fascinating is that they still haven't admitted any of this out loud. Most people around them have no idea what's happening internally. But someone close enough to observe them is beginning to notice that something feels different. They can't explain why. They only know this person's reactions no longer match the version of themselves they've been showing the world. And once those inconsistencies become impossible to hide, the truth will slowly reveal itself. Their expectations were never as solid as they believed. And reality is beginning to tell a very different story. And this next symbol makes that shift even clearer. The Two of Wands isn't showing me someone who's standing still. It's showing me someone caught between where they've been and where they desperately want to go next. What's interesting is that this person has spent so much time thinking about possible outcomes that they've almost forgotten one important thing. Eventually, a decision has to be made. I'm noticing that they revisit this connection in ways they never expected, not because they're trying to, because certain memories seem to arrive without permission. They'll be focused on something completely unrelated, and suddenly they're replaying a conversation the two of you had months or even years ago. Not the arguments, not the obvious moments. It's the small things. The way you laughed at something that wasn't even funny, a phrase you used all the time. A look you gave them that they didn't fully appreciate until much later. Those are the memories that seem to follow them now. And what surprises me is that every time one of those moments comes back, it changes the way they understand the past. They're no longer asking themselves why things ended. They're asking themselves whether they misunderstood what they had while they still had it. That's a very different question. Hold on. I'm getting something else. This person is putting a tremendous amount of effort into looking unaffected. If someone asked them directly how they feel about you, I don't think they'd answer honestly. They've become very good at appearing emotionally settled, very good at changing the subject, very good at acting as though life simply moved on. But internally, it's almost the opposite. They're comparing almost every new experience to something they once experienced with you. Not intentionally, it just happens. And every comparison seems to bring them back to the same place. The feeling that something meaningful was left unfinished, that's why they can't fully convince themselves to close this chapter. Part of them keeps believing there's still one conversation that never happened, one explanation that was never given, one moment that still belongs in your story together. But here's where the energy becomes even more interesting. As this person becomes increasingly consumed by these thoughts, someone around them is beginning to notice the change. Not because they've confessed anything. They haven't. It's showing up in smaller ways. Their attention drifts during conversations. They seem distracted. They hesitate before answering simple questions. Sometimes they smile while looking at their phone, only to quickly put it away as though nothing happened. Someone has started connecting those little changes together. They don't have the full picture yet, but they're beginning to realize that this person's heart is somewhere else. And once that realization settles in, it's going to explain why another energy is becoming far more uncomfortable than anyone realizes. For a long time, this person believed they understood how this story would unfold. They assumed that time would eventually erase whatever still connected the two of you. They assumed distance would slowly make everything feel less important. And perhaps more than anything, they assumed you would always remain emotionally available in some way. Not necessarily waiting for them, but emotionally connected to the version of the relationship they had carried in their own mind. Hold on. That's the expectation that's beginning to fall apart. Because what they're seeing now isn't someone trying to prove they've moved on. They're seeing someone who simply kept living, who continued growing without needing anyone's permission, who slowly rebuilt parts of themselves that may have once depended on outside validation. And there's something incredibly unsettling about witnessing that when you've quietly believed the past would always have the final word. What's fascinating is that this realization isn't creating anger. It's creating uncertainty. Every assumption they once relied on now seems less convincing than it did before. They started asking themselves questions they never thought they'd have to ask. What if I waited too long? What if they're genuinely happy without me? What if the version of them I keep remembering doesn't even exist anymore? Notice how different those questions are from where this reading began. At first, they were trying to avoid their emotions. Now they're questioning their own certainty. That's significant, because once certainty begins disappearing, control usually disappears with it. And I keep coming back to that feeling. They're realizing they can no longer predict where they stand in your life. Not because you've given them mixed signals, not because you've played games, simply because you've continued becoming your own person. There's another layer here. The more complete your life begins to feel from their perspective, the more they become aware of what they left unfinished inside themselves. It's almost as though your emotional stability has become an unexpected mirror, not showing them who you used to be, showing them everything they postponed, confronting within themselves. That's difficult to sit with, especially for someone who believed there would always be another opportunity to return whenever the timing felt right. Now, that confidence feels much less certain, and as that certainty continues fading, something else begins taking its place. Not panic, not desperation, something quieter, resolve. Because I'm beginning to sense that the person who has spent so long watching, remembering, and questioning is slowly reaching the point where thinking is no longer enough. They're starting to realize that if they want any chance of changing this story, they're going to have to become part of it again. Oh, the Ace of Pentacles immediately shifts the emotional focus again. A real chance. Not the imagined conversations this person has been replaying in their mind. Not the perfect apology they've rewritten 100 different ways. An actual moment where they may have to decide whether they continue protecting themselves or finally risk hearing the answer they've been afraid of. What's fascinating is that I don't think they've lacked the desire to reach out. They've lacked certainty. Those are two very different things. Desire says, I want to talk. Uncertainty asks, but what if they don't want to hear from me anymore? And that question has kept them frozen much longer than anyone realizes. I'm seeing countless moments where they almost convinced themselves to send a message. Maybe they typed something, then erased it. Maybe they opened an old conversation, read through it, closed it again. Maybe they searched for your profile without leaving any sign they'd been there. Each time they came close, fear quietly stepped back in. Not fear of rejection alone, fear of discovering that time had changed everything. Because as long as they remained silent, they could still imagine that another chance existed. The moment they reached out, that possibility would become reality, and reality doesn't always match hope. Hold on. There's something else happening beneath the surface. This person has started imagining conversations that haven't happened yet. They picture explaining themselves, not to justify what happened, but to finally say the things they couldn't say before. They imagine admitting they weren't as unaffected as they pretended. Admitting that pride became easier than vulnerability. Admitting that silence slowly became a habit they no longer knew how to break. What's interesting is that every imaginary conversation ends differently. Sometimes you forgive them, sometimes you simply listen, sometimes you walk away. It's that uncertainty that keeps interrupting every attempt they make, because they no longer fear telling the truth. They fear losing the opportunity before they've even spoken. And that's why this energy feels so heavy. Outwardly, very little appears to be changing. Internally, everything is changing. They're becoming less interested in protecting their image and more interested in protecting what still remains of this connection. Notice how different that is from where this reading began. Earlier, they were fighting against their own feelings. Now they're quietly searching for the courage to act on them. That's progress, even if nobody else can see it yet. There's another layer that keeps drawing my attention. This person has begun paying much closer attention to timing. They're wondering whether there's a right moment to reconnect, whether waiting another week would somehow make things easier, whether one more day would bring more clarity. But deep down, I don't think they're actually waiting for the perfect time. I think they're waiting to feel safe. The problem is that emotional courage rarely arrives before action. It usually arrives because of it. And that's the realization they're slowly approaching. They're beginning to understand that no amount of overthinking will give them the certainty they're searching for. No perfect sentence, no perfect explanation, no perfect moment. Only a choice. Either remain silent and continue wondering, or finally take the risk they've been postponing for far too long. And I'm sensing that something completely outside of their control is about to make that choice much harder to avoid. Someone or something is about to create the opening they've been telling themselves they were waiting for. The Three of Pentacles immediately catches my attention because it isn't showing one person standing alone. It's revealing how separate lives quietly begin influencing one another, not through dramatic confrontations, not through carefully planned conversations, but through small moments that slowly become impossible to ignore. And I think that's exactly what's happening here. This person believed they could keep everything separate, their memories in one place, their emotions somewhere else, their daily life untouched by either. But that's becoming impossible, because life has a way of bringing unfinished feelings back into ordinary moments. I'm also sensing a shift in how they view responsibility. Earlier, they focused on what they lost, what they missed, what they wished had been different. Now the question has changed. What role did I play in creating this distance? That's not easy to face, especially for someone who's spent so long protecting themselves from regret. Hold on. This feels important. They're realizing that silence wasn't neutral. For a long time, they treated inaction as though it wasn't really a decision. But time has shown them otherwise. Not choosing was still a choice. Not speaking still changed the story. And that's one of the hardest truths they've had to accept. Because accountability isn't always admitting you were completely wrong. Sometimes it's recognizing that fear made decisions love never wanted to make. That's the energy here. Not blame. Awareness. And that awareness isn't pushing them farther away. It's doing the opposite. The more honestly they face their own part in everything, the less interested they become in defending the past. And the more they wonder whether something meaningful can still be rebuilt. That's why this energy feels so different from where we started. At first, they were trapped inside their thoughts. Now those thoughts are becoming intentions. Not fully formed plans, but real intentions. Reaching out no longer feels impossible. It feels like a difficult decision they may soon have to make. There's another layer unfolding at the same time. People around them are beginning to notice subtle changes. They seem quieter, more thoughtful. Certain conversations affect them more deeply than before. Not because they have less to say, because they're choosing their words more carefully. That tells me something inside them is changing. Their priorities are shifting. The things that once seemed urgent no longer matter as much. And the things they dismissed as impossible suddenly feel worth exploring. But while this person slowly finds the courage to face themselves, I can't ignore that second energy we've been following. Because every step they take toward honesty seems to make someone else increasingly uncomfortable. They're sensing that something they believed would never change is changing anyway. And as this reunion energy quietly gathers momentum, their emotional balance is becoming harder and harder to hold together. During the day, people can stay busy, they can answer messages, go to work, laugh at the right moments, keep moving. But when everything becomes quiet, that's when the conversations they never had begin playing over and over again. And that's exactly where I feel this person is now. Earlier in this reading, they were questioning the past. Now they're questioning themselves. They're replaying moments they once dismissed without a second thought. Small decisions, brief conversations, the times they chose pride over honesty, the times they assumed there would always be another opportunity. What's interesting is that they're no longer looking for someone else to blame. They're beginning to understand that healing sometimes starts with accepting the parts of ourselves we'd rather not examine. Hold on, because the second energy we've been following is changing too. And this is where these two stories quietly begin crossing paths. The more the person who wants reunion becomes emotionally honest, the more unsettled the other individual becomes, not because anyone is forcing a confrontation. Nothing dramatic has happened. From what I'm seeing, most of this has unfolded beneath the surface. But emotional shifts have a way of changing the atmosphere around people. They become more present, more reflective, less predictable, and those subtle changes are difficult to hide from someone who's paying close attention. I'm getting the feeling that this second person keeps searching for reassurance. They want to believe nothing has really changed. They tell themselves they're imagining things, that these recent differences are temporary. But every quiet observation seems to point in the same direction. Something inside the situation is moving. What's fascinating is that neither of these individuals seems fully aware of how much they're influencing one another. The person who wants reunion believes they're carrying this emotional weight alone. The stressed observer believes they're reacting to circumstances they can still control. Yet both of them are responding to the same reality. Your life didn't remain frozen. Your emotional world kept expanding. Whether that meant finding peace, rediscovering your confidence, or simply learning to trust yourself again, that quiet transformation has become impossible for either of them to ignore. Notice how everything keeps returning to that same theme, not control. Change. Because once one person truly begins changing, everyone connected to that story has to decide how they'll respond. Some people grow. Some people resist. Some people realize far too late that they've been holding on to an old version of someone who no longer exists. And I can't help noticing one final layer beginning to emerge. The person who wants reunion isn't only afraid of losing you anymore. They're afraid they've misunderstood this connection from the very beginning. Because the more honestly they examine everything that's happened, the more they realize that what has kept them attached all this time may not be regret alone. It may be something much deeper. Something they've been quietly carrying since long before the separation. And once that truth finally reaches the surface, everything we've talked about until now begins to make sense in an entirely different way. And clarity, the Ten of Cups, the kind of clarity that only arrives after someone spends a long time searching everywhere else for something they quietly left behind. What's fascinating is that I don't think they've been looking for you specifically. At least that's what they kept telling themselves. They believed they were searching for peace, for stability, for a life that finally felt complete. They thought that if they achieved enough, experienced enough, met enough new people, something inside them would finally settle. But it never did. Hold on. This feels like the missing piece. They're not realizing that no one else mattered. They're realizing that no other connection brought out the version of themselves they became with you. There's a difference. Sometimes we miss someone because they made us feel loved. Sometimes because they made us feel understood. But sometimes we miss someone because they reflected a part of ourselves we've never been able to find again. That's the energy I'm feeling here. This isn't simply nostalgia. Nostalgia remembers moments. This feels like remembering the person they were becoming before fear interrupted the journey. That's why letting go has never truly worked. Not because they didn't try, because every new beginning quietly reminded them of what was missing. I'm noticing another shift. Earlier, they wondered whether you would accept hearing from them. Now they're asking something much deeper. Are they finally ready to become the person they should have been all along? That's a powerful realization, because reunion is no longer about returning to the past. It's about whether two people who have grown separately can finally meet with honesty, without pretending, without hiding, without expecting one person to carry the emotional weight. Notice how much they've changed. They began by denying their feelings. Then they questioned their choices. Then they accepted responsibility. Now they understand they never wanted just another chance. They wanted the chance to show up differently. And strangely enough, that's exactly what's unsettling the second energy we've been following. They're beginning to sense this isn't another passing emotional cycle. It feels quieter, more intentional, less impulsive, as though something building beneath the surface for a very long time can no longer stay hidden. There's one final layer before we finish. The reason this person can't let go was never just loneliness, never just pride, never simply the fear of losing what they once had. It's because after everything they've experienced and every version of themselves they've tried to become, they've reached one quiet realization. Some connections aren't measured by how long they lasted. They're measured by how deeply they changed the people within them. And once someone truly understands that, the next choice they make has the power to change everything. There's still one final message waiting beneath all of this. And it's the piece that brings every card, every emotion, and every unanswered question together. The moon feels like the perfect final symbol for everything we've uncovered together. Not because it speaks about illusion, because it speaks about what remains beneath the surface until we're finally ready to face it. And isn't that where this reading began? With one truth that refused to stay hidden. We've spent this journey exploring someone's hesitation, regret, and the pressure quietly building inside them. But now I'm realizing something important. The greatest uncertainty was never whether they still felt connected to you. It was whether they could trust themselves enough to stop hiding from that connection. The moon reminds us that people often mistake uncertainty for absence. They assume that if they can't explain what they're feeling, those feelings can't be real. But the heart rarely works that way. Sometimes the deepest emotions appear when they make the least logical sense. I'm seeing this person finally accept something they've resisted for a long time. Not every answer comes before action. Sometimes clarity follows honesty. Hold on. There's one final layer that ties everything together. Throughout this reading, we've followed two different emotional journeys. One person slowly awakened to feelings they thought were gone. Another became increasingly unsettled as circumstances shifted beyond their expectations. Yet neither story is really about control. It's about change, because your own journey quietly became the turning point neither of them expected. Not because you fought for recognition, not because you tried to prove your worth, simply because you kept becoming more yourself. That's something I hope you truly hear today. Growth has a way of revealing truth without ever needing to argue for it. The people who are meant to notice. The people who still have lessons to learn will learn them in their own time. That's why I don't want this reading to leave you focused only on what someone else may choose. Free will always matters. No card can make someone's decisions. No reading can promise an outcome. What these cards can do is reveal emotional patterns that become clearer when we step back. And looking at this entire story, the pattern has remained remarkably consistent. Hidden truth became awareness. Awareness became accountability. Accountability became intention. And intention slowly replaced fear. At the same time, someone else's certainty quietly began to fall apart. Not because anyone defeated them, but because reality no longer matched the story they believed. Your healing changed the emotional landscape for everyone connected to it. What's beautiful is that none of this asks you to pause your own life. Quite the opposite. Keep becoming the person you've been growing into. Protect your peace. Choose relationships where honesty speaks louder than pride. Because if someone truly wants to become part of your story again, the reunion won't be built on beautiful words. It will be built on consistent actions. That's what this entire reading has been pointing toward. Not promises. Presence. Not longing. Growth. Not repeating the past, but learning from it. If this message resonated with you, take what feels meaningful and simply leave the rest behind. Thank you so much for sharing this reading with me today. I'd love to hear what stood out to you most, so feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed today's reading, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and join me again next time. Until then, take good care of yourself,